The surveillance network includes, but is not limited to, its connections to the function of the medical community under fake experimentation for political ambitions, such as, but is not limited to, the fascist public-private partnerships, which specifically generate individual promotions of arbitrary development for the Confederates, such as the position of poisoning people, which subsequently changes the DNA. And in the attempt to change the DNA, similar to how they did in Monsanto, they generate a patent for the actual code for the DNA derived by poisoned, which generates a specific line. Now, if you conduct that for their interest in the pollution of the general public, such as their traumatization of the um, sexuality or destruction of testosterone by putting poisons into the general water supply, which are specifically developed as an expansion of the reference by Alex Jones turning the frogs gay meme, is actually being produced for the express purpose of that satanic ritual, which is specifically being maintained by the Marxist Leninist Confederate Insurrection, which have literally made a deal with the devil, which has the Druids' priesthood manipulating them, such as, but it's not limited to, the Bohemian Grove, which generates the pretense of their systematic infection and overthrow of the religious functions into compelled state religions by the Confederacy against the Americans in the specific war against the Constitution. Now, this includes, but is not limited to, their development, such as their character for her teen, which is actively promoting the pretense of evergreen and other specific systems designed for the express distribution of fake medical excuses for the use of the enforcement of the communism by secrecy, what they could not obtain legally in the open sphere, which generates the activity of their system of defrauding the government by the mechanism of creating a wizard class of the general public, which has systematically replaced the authority of the civilian government with the Confederate anarchists enforcing their arbitrary insurrection, which generates systems of threats to the public generated by the long-standing communist arrangement of destroying the United States without firing a single shot, which started with the USSR and matured into the Communist Chinese as well as others, which have hyper invested into these pretenses of corrupting the system and capturing politicians who would then defend the system of the corruption by the Confederacy and its factions, which was happy to accept them as the Confederates were exponentially losing ground historically, which required these fracturing of its loyalties in order for it to regain potential for the criminal use of the unitary executive theory by William Barr's Insurrection, such as, but it's not limited to, the attack on the Constitution by punishments for crimes not committed, which were merely predicted inside their own bias chamber or echo chamber, specifically prohibited by the Constitution, which is their enemy in war, which is exponentially expanded in their arbitrary arrangements as anarchists, conducting all of their functions without service of law through extra law or extra to law or in rejection or replacement or anti law, which generates their system of arbitrary insurrection by terrorist hate groups, which functionally infects the general public by the FBI's terror factory without the conviction system, which generates the pretense of non convictable protected terrorists who have been radicalized by the cult loyalty to the Confederacy, generated by their higher loyalty to the Confederacy against the United States, which gives them the fake justification to defraud or lie to the government systematically for the corruption and evolution of the United States as the parasite infecting the American government systemically replaces the American government until it ceases to exist except for the husk of its former self, at which point it may completely be disregarded, at which point the system of national security of these United States requires the existence of the dual, which acknowledges the obligation to David Bowles from the time of the kidnapping by the Confederates by the function of Congress's obligation to make these admissions, which those corrupted by the communists have specifically ignored for the express advantage of overthrowing the aristocracy according to the protocols of learned out of Zion, which generates their defense against the aristocracy of the Americans, which is stronger than the Confederates, using Confederate policy in favor of American interest and hegemony, maturing the development by their defrauding of the government to engage in criminally prohibited wars of attrition to change status without due process by the system of their kidnapping and arbitrary procedures designed as the punishment itself, exhausting all forms of the normal social engagement in the general society, subsequently changing status without due process in order to negatively impact human decency without due process, which is fundamental to their satanic rituals, changing the functional expectation of reasonable suspicions, which is the foundation of their pre-crime, which has already laundered their bias in the looking glass military intelligence as they collapse society and plan the wars against its allies and those that have been negotiated into forms of peace, as it is fundamental to their existence that war is the racket as their primary source of income, as the military to the Confederates is not a non-profit engagement, but rather it is the primary source of income, as devouring society is the primary resource or preferred food designed by their world parasite. These systems include, but are not limited to, the arbitrary terrorism by the surveillance structures without the warrants by the FISA and other mechanisms, such as the fake courts created by Biden in order to defend the surveillance system by those who have already sworn loyalty to the insurrection, which generates their arbitrary use of surveillance, which allows them to invade people's homes by the surveillance, which allows them to engage in the manipulation, such as, but is not limited to, electrocution. Now, the electric therapy fake position in order to engage in social violence for social engineering in order to engage in the compelled conformity, which was criminalized from the foundation of the Constitution, which also was recognized as an offense which generated a remedy by some Oregon kid who had received the electric shock attacks, who received uh, an order from the court to receive compensation. I don't have the exact numbers on me, but later on, their character for Donald Trump supported the use of those electrocutions, such as, but not as limited to, the function of sheriffs through the Ninth Circuit court structure, defense of the use of electric shock for the functions that they conduct inside the system, such as the electrocution of parties who were depressed, such as, but it's not limited to, the function of the arbitrary negative emotions derived by abuses from their excesses, at which point the beatings will continue until morale improves, as the basic standard is strictly prohibited by the American Constitution, but ignored by the disloyal members who have infiltrated the court systems in order to destroy these United States. And those who systemically hate the United States have used these advantages in order to promote these functions in the absence of David by the sedition in the additional functions of those connected to the original checks and balances system, who would have also been essential to the enforcement of the checks and balances, countering these offenses against society. This social violence includes the economic violence from the hate group, which has generated the pretense of the assault being used for the obstruction of contracts, manipulations, illusions, and defamations by the out of context scenarios created in their simulations under their specific control, generating the expansion of the psychopaths and their gossip, which generates their ability to make an exponential quantity of investments for the diverse subversions of the general public by those activities with the fake cover of secrets by the Confederacy, or the claim that Confederate spells of insurrection against the United States cannot have a remedy, as a remedy would require an American government function, which they are not. And since they are not, and they are protected by the double agents which refuse to allow the crimes to be processed through the court systems correctly by anyone loyal to the Americans, generates the pretense of the defense against the spells by the failure of allowing the general public to be able to speak to the government, and the censorship of the general public's ability to go to the court structure by these abuses and censorships and obstructions for their illusions designed to subsequently change status by the exhaustion, so that the parties in question would become depressed financially beyond their capacity to engage in any financial reaction to the insurrection, would generate the pretense of a lack of remedy by the use of overly expensive structures, which would normally be affordable um, as a strategy of war against the United States government. To this end, the claim of unitary executive theory by those who were promoting Donald Trump's case, hyper focusing on the ability of the president to commit crimes in the rejection of the system by the use of their compromise of the system, blocking the Senate from being able to engage in any credible impeachment structures in any competent form, which prevents the capability of impeachment, which prevents the capability of prosecutions, as the impeachment is essential to the prosecution according to the fraudulent argument, which generates the protection of the president in his arbitrary assignments, such as, but it's not limited to, the enforcement orders of the communism to secretly murder or sabotage or commit extraordinary conscious shocking crimes against their political adversaries, such as David and his political party, which were obstructed by the Confederates under the general claim that they are essential to the United States government, and thus threatened the Democrats into compliance and subjugation to it, as the Democrats were then actively corrupted and evolved by that process for the promotion of the communism and the fracturing of the Confederacy and the exceptions of new intake of new loyalists, according to the carrot and stick strategy commonly used by the FBI and practiced throughout the intelligence community, which specifically generates their subordination to the insurrection against these United States for the military strategy of the coup against America from the 80s, according to the record, by their bastard child of communism, giving birth to the American white supremacist communism on the wider spread generated for these specific purposes, as communism from the Confederacy white supremacists was defeated by the Americans, which turned into their investment of their bastard child fascism from the Nazis, which then recreated the communism birthed from its bastard child, as their inbred system eats its own shit and progresses according their satanic magic. These systems of fraud by the communist strategy of marrying a truth to a lie generates the inch by inch progress of the treason, which generates the destruction of the American hegemony and its national interests abroad, which has systemically been generated by their centrally planned economy and its planned obsolescence as it is designed to be hyper promoted in the celebration of itself and collapsed into the crash of the bubbles, which are pre planned to destroy the general public's access to the information, which is why they promote their capacity for their bankers and brokers, etc., to be able to commit all kinds of various felonies and other crimes for the express purpose that they are an enemy of the United States, and the collapse of the structure by the nonviolent mechanisms before they engage in their hot war tactics is fundamental to the progress of their Nazi investment into lawfare, which generates the false presumption that the government has authority to make anyone an enemy of the government or to make anyone guilty of anything, which generates their capacity to engage in the Manchurian candidate, which allows them to exponentially promote their criminal market, which increases the quantity of crime on a whole as it is a profitable racket.